Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back so promptly after coffee, and welcome to a discussion of the Indo-Pacific. As mentioned, my name is Simon Long. I'm a journalist with The Economist. I'm an Asan recidivist. I keep coming back because I find these events so valuable, and I'm extremely grateful to Asan for putting them on, and congratulate the institution on its 10th anniversary. When we come to talking about the Indo-Pacific, I feel a bit like that character in Molière's play who was very pleased with himself when he suddenly discovered that without knowing it all his life he'd been speaking fluent prose. And on the Indo-Pacific, I discovered that for a long time I've been working on and in the Indo-Pacific without, until quite recently, knowing it. The spread of the term, it seems to me, is though James was modestly denying this just now, it seems to me a tribute to Australian and Indian soft power. It's only about a decade ago that the term came into use in India. Australia has been particularly vigorous in promoting the concept. And I think in this context, talking about how it fits in, if it fits into a view of the liberal international order and the threats it's under, it's perhaps a particularly useful way of looking at it. And it's very appropriate in that context that I'm joined on the panel by James Choi, Australia's ambassador here in South Korea, by Vikram Doraiswami, India's ambassador, by James Liow from Singapore, from the RSIS, the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU, by Mark Lippert, another former ambassador here from the US, but now with Boeing International, and at the far end, Yong of the University of Macau and the University of New South Wales. The format will by now be quite familiar to you. We will ask for short presentations from each of our panelists. I will then try and provoke an argument between them, and assuming I fail, I will throw it open to the floor to have questions and comments from you all. Thank you. So we could start going along the panel in alphabetical order. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very much flattered by the introduction of Australia's role in putting the Indo-Pacific concept forward, and it is very much front and centre of Australia's foreign policy. But being here in Seoul, I know that the concept of Indo-Pacific has generated much debate, especially following President Trump's visit to Asia, both to Japan, Korea, and then to Vietnam, where he promoted the concept of Indo-Pacific. And the response here in the Republic of Korea was quite interesting. I think the formal response from the Korean government was they didn't quite understand the concept, they didn't know what it meant, and it's too early to start discussing it. But certainly from Australia's perspective, as Simon mentioned, we've been using this term for a very long time. In the academic circles, certainly in the 90s, 2000s, but then formally for the Australian government in 2013, when the government of Tony Abbott came into power, my Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, started using the term Indo-Pacific to describe Australia's foreign policy priorities. The term Indo-Pacific has been used in our 2013 and 2016 Defence White Papers, and most recently in 2017 in our Foreign Policy White Paper. For Australia, the Indo-Pacific is a geographic reality. Our east coast of our Australian continent faces the Pacific, our west coast faces the Indian Ocean. But more than geographic reality, it's an economic and strategic reality. Most of our major partners, trading partners, are in Northeast Asia. Our major trading partners are China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea in that order. But what we're seeing from Australia, from the Southern Hemisphere, is a shift of economic weight westward. China will continue to grow, but you see its growth plateauing. The rapidly growing ASEANs are noticeable. Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world, is growing rapidly, as is Vietnam. And India is starting to grow and reaching its potential, especially with its demographic assets, very much a youthful population that will continue to grow. I think a lot of the debate that has been focused on here at ASEAN has been the US-China contest. And I certainly believe that will shape our region. And it is the dynamic under which we will certainly face a different region in the future. But I would suggest that India will play a much greater role in the region, especially as it looks eastward, using its own strategic weight and political influence and diplomatic influence, but also as China looks westward. that India-China axis will play a greater role, another axis of competition in the Indo-Pacific region. I just want to touch on the Indo-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific concept and what it is not, because there's been a lot of media debate as to what it is and what it isn't. Firstly, from Australia's perspective, Indo-Pacific, and our use of the term, is not code for containing China. From Australia's perspective, we don't see that we can contain China. I don't think it's possible, even if we tried. There's a lot of conjecture also about the quadrilateral dialogue. That is a group formed by United States, Japan, India, and Australia. And many media commentators and academics suggesting that the Quad equates to Australia's Indo-Pacific approach. All I can say is the Quad is simply a loose grouping of like-minded countries with shared interests in the region, the Indo-Pacific region, and it is simply one element of our approach to the Indo-Pacific. There is no shared Indo-Pacific strategy among Quad members. We define it in our own ways, but what we do in the Quad is we promote a very simple concept, the concept of open, inclusive, secure, and prosperous region, free of coercion. And that's the principle that binds us together in the Quad. I'll just go on the principles because it's not just the geographic dimension of the Indo-Pacific concept, but it's the principles that we want to promote in the Indo-Pacific region that I think is the focus of Australian diplomacy. I know that the concept of liberal international order is being used, or the illiberal international order is the focus or title of this conference. But Australia's preference is to use the term rules-based order because it gives a greater definition to what we're trying to promote. It's the treaties, the rules, the norms, the institutions, the protocols that guide the behavior and actions between states. And it is true that we are living in a contested world that are trying to undermine these principles. Use of economic coercion, actions short of war, cyber is a new frontier. But then simple things such as freedom of navigation, which are being undermined by actions of states. The principle that guides Australian foreign policy is that we would not support a world governed by the use of power. It should be governed by rules. The rules that we're seeking to promote in the Indo-Pacific region are open markets, the ability to freely trade ideas and capital between countries. As I mentioned before, the freedom of navigation that has underpinned the remarkable growth of trade in the Pacific. The right of small states to be treated as equals and not to be coerced. And the rules that discipline power among the larger states. But most importantly, rules that govern competition. That competition is not done by unilateral actions, but are guided by the principles of international law. I know that a lot of the debate has been about US-China contest, and I think there are many experts in this room that are better placed to discuss that. But I don't think it's a fait accompli that dynamic will govern the Indo-Pacific. And Australia's diplomatic efforts are focused on the strands and relationships, the alliances, our diplomatic efforts that can ensure that these principles and rules are adhered to and observed. And the focus really, apart from our engagement in the United States as our most important ally, but also China as an important trading partner, is to work closely with the great democracies in the region, Japan, India, Indonesia, and the Republic of Korea, working closely bilaterally, but also in small groupings to underpin and support and nurture the rules-based order. And certainly the small groupings I'm referring to are things like the trilateral strategic dialogue between Japan, Australia, and the United States, and the trilateral we've established with India, Japan, and Australia. And as I mentioned previously, the Quad. But it's also the ASEANs. The ASEANs will play an increasingly greater role in the region, and Australia has recently held a special summit with the ASEAN leaders in Sydney in March. And the Sydney Declaration that stemmed from that underpins very much the principles that I've outlined just before. I can't go about talking the Indo-Pacific without talking about trade, because Australia is very concerned about the increased protectionist sentiments that are emerging, especially the prospects for a China-US trade war. Australia's view is, and aspirations is, for a region-wide arrangement on trade that will promote regional trade integration, and promote trade liberalisation. So CPTPP is the first step in that. Australia is also very active in the RCEP arrangements. We're hoping that that will eventually lead to a region-wide arrangement on free trade that binds all the countries together on the principles of trade and free and open trade. I'm very much reminded in the contests that we're seeing emerging in the region about Thucydides and what he wrote about the Peloponnesian Wars, that the strong will do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. Australia certainly does not believe that that is the fate of our Indo-Pacific region. We can't rely on major powers to safeguard our interests. And certainly from Australia's perspective, we have to take responsibility for our own security and prosperity. And the Indo-Pacific and the rules-based order is the highest foreign policy priority for us to ensure that the Thucydides trap and the prediction, the fatalistic prediction from the Peloponnesian Wars does not apply to the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Vikram.
Thank you very much. And thank you also to the Asan Institute for having me here again this year. Like Simon, I'm also an Asan recidivist, having come here again year after year. I wanted to try and build off quickly from some of the points that James made, and because, I mean, much of it is in sync with what I would have said myself, except perhaps for the Australian foreign policy portions. Let me begin by underlining what we see in India as the core of the Indo-Pacific strategy. First of all, geographically speaking, historically India has seen itself in a foreign policy sense as being continental looking. If you sit in Delhi, the tendency tends to be to look northwards, westwards, and eastwards at the landmasses of Asia around us. But historically, actually, India is as much a maritime power because more than 2/3 of our territory actually is sort of peninsular. Therefore, from that perspective, an Indo-Pacific strategy for it to be meaningful to us essentially involves covering the entire swathe of territory from the east coast of Africa all the way up to the western seaboard of the Americas continent. Sounds like an ambitious aspiration because historically India has defined its strategic interests in the circle that can be encompassed between the Straits of Malacca and the Gulf of Aden. But expanding geography, expanding economic interactions with the ASEAN states, with Australia, with Japan, and the Republic of Korea, and of course our large transcontinental relationship with the United States, makes it evident that India needs to have a footprint and a mindset that looks beyond the immediate Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal construct. Logically, therefore, this is a construct that covers geography, economic interest, energy interest, and larger strategic value. You could put that in a Mackinderian sense and say that, in a sense, this is the return of the notion of a maritime versus a continental dilemma for India. But for us to have a coherent strategy of managing the maritime is now increasingly crucial as the Asia-Pacific becomes increasingly the center for contestation over both resource but also for geopolitical footholds. We see this as the center for global growth, the center for global transfers of energy supplies, and in a sense, transoceanic highway 101, which essentially links the markets of the western seaboard of the Atlantic, of the Pacific, and the markets of East Asia with Southeast Asia and South Asia, with the energy markets and the energy suppliers and the commodity suppliers of Africa and the Middle East. Management of the global commons, this is another area in which the Indo-Pacific concept is going to be of greater importance. It is critical from the standpoint of climate change, from the standpoint of management of one of the world's biggest carbon sinks, and it is also critical for food security. Management of food security will be a critical aspect to consider as you look at the populations of China and India essentially having greater resources at their capacity to source food and to source goods. So management of the global commons is the third and important perspective which we look at when we revisit this construct. As James suggested, the construct has also evolved over the years. In an Indian perspective, it has actually sort of waxed and waned, if I were to look at it in the last 10 years. Not so long ago, it was common to have Indian sort of formal statements on the subject talk about the Asia-Pacific region and the Indian Ocean region. Over the last few years, however, there has been a greater evolution of our position to essentially telescope these two together as the Indo-Pacific, recognizing, in a sense, that talking about an Asia-Pacific and an Indian Ocean region was somewhat an artificial construct, both geographically and also from the main standpoints that I tried to place before you: energy, economics, food security, and climate change. Taking that point a little bit further, let me just try and outline to you how we in India visualize the Indian perspective on the Indo-Pacific. Speaking in the Seychelles a year and a half ago, our Prime Minister talked about what he described as, he's fond of acronyms, so this is one of his acronyms, SAGAR, which in Hindi actually means oceans. It actually expanded out into security and growth for all in the Indian Ocean region, SAGAR. This essentially was explained out in more comprehensive terms as working on the bilateral, regional, and plurilateral tracks to develop a few key principles. The first is the idea of a consensual, rules-based international order, ensuring a climate of trust and transparency amongst all countries in the region, recognizing that countries in the region and beyond have interests in the area. It's critical to ensure the engagement of all on the basis of this rules-based system, with equal security of all, respect for the international maritime rules and norms by all parties concerned, and the sensitivity necessary for a rules-based order to work to each other's concerns. Based upon this is also the recognition that there are areas of dispute, there are areas of non-consensus, and therefore the need for peaceful resolution of these disputes to find ways in which we could find win-win solutions to all. Essentially, he summarized this, our Prime Minister summarized this in June 2016 in his statement at the US Congress, where he essentially said, and I quote, "The purpose of engagement in the Indo-Pacific must be to promote cooperation and not dominance, connectivity and not isolation, respect for the global commons, inclusive and not exclusive mechanisms, and finally, adherence to international rules and norms." Now, having said this, this is the good part, as they say. What are the concerns? Why is this an issue that we need to talk about? Essentially, because the Indo-Pacific will increasingly feature the complex challenge of accommodating the needs of rising countries in Asia, primarily, of course, the rise of China, which is an established fact, the rise of India, which is a process that is underway, and the rise of a more prosperous, more integrated ASEAN. Each of these three is a critical new factor in the evolution of how the Indo-Pacific is going to be. With this is the continued interest of the United States in maintaining its foothold, political, geopolitical, and economic. The important role of key established East Asian economies and Pacific economies, that's Australia, Japan, and Korea, and the management, therefore, of outliers and their patrons within this larger construct. Outliers including North Korea, for instance, in this complex construct. So managing the existing challenges and managing new challenges that come about as we look at a new and, how should I say it, a new and more complicated structure of an so-called Asian century in the 21st century, right? I'd say from our perspective in India, the biggest concern would really be the rise of actions being taken on the basis of worst-case scenarios. So states plan for a certain set of engagements and hedge against a certain set of worst-case scenario assumptions. These could be looking at the actions of other countries and saying, in this case, our actions need to be, our countermeasures need to be set out in this form. And the risk is that actions beget actions and drive towards a particular goal without necessarily sort of unpacking the risks that go with it. Let me be a little more clear on that, since I'm speaking somewhat elliptically on this case. If you consider the risk involved in trying to understand what the Quad stands for, as James pointed out very clearly, it is not an intention to constrain or to contain any country. It is clearly an intention to cooperate among like-minded countries. However, if it is seen as a measure of containment, it creates actions, it generates fears that will create countermeasures against it. So it is critical that states within the region are able to talk to each other and allay these concerns and create the framework for a more cooperative, more consensus-based international order within the region. This is critical because there is fundamentally a deficit of security structures within the region. Overall security management structures have only started to come into play from the last decade of the 20th century, in which ASEAN and the ASEAN Regional Forum, and based on thereafter the East Asia Summit process, have created some mechanisms for us to be able to talk about existential security threats. But we need to be able to go much further, to be able to take on, in a regional and also larger extra-regional sense, security challenges within the region. We see overall one final challenge, which is managing the disconnect between geopolitics, the contestation of geopolitics in the region, and geoeconomics. As was made amply clear a little earlier today in the first session, growth within Asia and trade within Asia has now become one of the main drivers of economic development. And yet, politics has not actually caught up with that. So today you have a situation where as I've forgotten which of the panelists in the last session suggested this, but 40 countries in the world have China as their major trading partner. And another 100 countries have China as their second or third largest trading partner. Yeah, I think Yukon Huang made that point. And yet, the quality of our dialogues and our political management, the management of our political relations vis-a-vis China, for many countries, has not been of the same order of magnitude that goes to the sort of importance of their their economic relationships.
It has been India's largest trading partner for what, 15, 20 years now?
Yes. So to give it a personal flavor for a moment, when I completed my tenure in China in the year 2000, our trade with China was just around the $2 billion mark. Since then, it has grown over 45 times, almost. It's nearing the $85 billion mark right now. So what is critical in this is to see how fast economics or geoeconomics has outstripped politics, and to see if we can find a via media between the two now, before we find ourselves overtaken by events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vikram. James.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to be on this distinguished panel. Let me start first by saying that I appreciate very much James' point that he made regarding the fact that we really are grappling with the rules-based order here as opposed to the liberal international order. The reason why I say that is because I think in Southeast Asia, there will be a perspective that what we know as the liberal international order may not necessarily be as liberal or as international as we sometimes unproblematically and uncritically assume it to be. But that's for another discussion. Now, on the free and open Indo-Pacific, from the perspective of Southeast Asia, again, there's a lot of interest, a lot of curiosity, in part because to many of us, it's still a somewhat nebulous concept, long on statements of principle and aspiration, and somewhat short at the moment still on substance. So regional states are taking a wait-and-see kind of approach. Nevertheless, rightly or wrongly, there is a belief that underlying this is the notion that some of the regional powers need to respond to China's growing dominance and ability to shape regional affairs. Now, this is different from containment, okay? It's substantively different from containment, but nevertheless, needing to respond to that reality. Now, so let me get straight to the point as far as Southeast Asia's response to the Indo-Pacific idea or concept is concerned. I'll outline 3 reasons why Southeast Asia is cautiously receptive to it, and 3 reasons why they are reticent towards it. So, cautiously receptive. Number 1, it is a means through which the Trump administration has articulated its desire to continue being engaged in the region. Those of you who know Southeast Asia, and that's pretty much the entire room, you know how exercised the region is and has been about this question of American commitment, American engagement. Enough is never enough for us. So to the extent that all the concerns about the possibilities, the risks of disengagement were to some extent addressed by Trump's very long, extended visit to East Asia, which included 2 stops in Southeast Asia. And in that context, the articulation of the Indo-Pacific, this is something that, that piqued interest, perhaps even relief to some extent. But questions remain. To what extent is this a continuation of the rebalance or the pivot? We're told that the pivot is dead or the rebalance is dead, but there are some aspects of it that could possibly look very suspiciously like what we saw before, right? Number 2, there are preliminary indications that regional powers may be actively involved, and this is, of course, welcomed. Southeast Asia's strategic perspective with regards to external powers has shifted substantively from the 1970s to today. You will recall in the 1970s, they had this aspiration to keep external powers out of the region. You know, it was wishful thinking, and I think the Southeast Asians acknowledge that as well, not just today, but back then even. But today is different. Today is increasing the slate of stakeholders is something to be encouraged. But with a caveat, the caveat being the continuation of, if not ASEAN centrality, certainly ASEAN's relevance. And I'll get to that point a bit more later. And number 3, free and open, right? With regard again to the rules-based order, these are principles that regional states are very happy to endorse and support and embrace. And the reason why is, I think, obvious and evident to all, given some of the developments, not just with regards to certain powers with certain claims in the geographical heart of Southeast Asia, but also other powers who seem to want to take a step back from their traditional roles as the defenders of and major proponents of the rules-based order. This has been a cause for concern. Now, moving on to the reticence, 3 reasons why Southeast Asia will remain reticent. Number 1, where is Southeast Asia's place in the Indo-Pacific beyond the geography? Geographically, yes, you know, we are sort of center, right? Right at the center. But strategically, where is Southeast Asia? How would the Indo-Pacific accommodate ASEAN's desire towards centrality in the regional architecture, be it economic, be it strategic, political? This, I think, has not yet been addressed in the context of the Indo-Pacific, certainly not to a degree that is comfortable for the ASEANs. Number 2, how are Southeast Asian interests to be integrated into the Indo-Pacific? So, for example, I think, Vikram, you alluded to the Quad, so we're talking about mechanisms here. There's a tendency, I think, to conflate the Indo-Pacific with the Quad. I don't think we want to be careful about doing that. And as James also mentioned, the Quad is probably just one expression of various institutions that address this issue. There are various trilaterals as well. So where does ASEAN fit in this, especially given the proliferation of ASEAN mechanisms that we have seen, as Vikram pointed out, over the last two decades, right? We all know that ASEAN places a lot of currency in the existing ASEAN-led organizations, you know. So is there a disconnect there, or can that somehow be reconciled? Still not too clear. And I think it's particularly pronounced, this concern is particularly pronounced in the realm of trade and economics. This is an issue that ASEAN is especially interested in, and given recent developments, particularly nervous and anxious about, given that the US, like it or not, is going to be the central pin in this Indo-Pacific. The Trump administration's ability to somehow separate geopolitics from geoeconomics and approach the two in a very transactional manner, this doesn't inspire much confidence among the ASEAN states. And third and final point, what are the objectives and agendas of the Indo-Pacific concept, whoever articulates it, beyond the broad statements, right? So the point was made that it should not, cannot, and is not about containment of China. The problem with that is that you not only have to persuade ASEAN, which you have to do, more importantly, you have to persuade China. Yeah. And if China is not persuaded that it is not inherently an effort to contain it, China is going to respond. Part of that response would be through a manner that we've been discussing through the last day and a half, you know, using the kind of leverage that they have accumulated already in the region and beyond, you know, and that puts ASEAN in the Southeast Asian states in a very difficult position. So that is something that they are watching very carefully. I'll end by saying that at the end of the day, regardless of all this talk about ASEAN centrality, ASEAN is acutely aware that they are essentially price takers in this whole enterprise. And it's precisely because of that, that's why ASEAN talks the talk of centrality. So the question then is the external powers, to the extent that they believe that ASEAN needs to be part of that conversation, that would include grappling with this issue of ASEAN centrality as well, as they try to flesh out what the Indo-Pacific is and should be about.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Mark.
Oh, well, thank you. And great to be back here in Korea. Never a dull moment. And as people once, a friend of mine once told me, you know, Korea is called the land of morning calm, but actually, you know, when you read the newspapers, it actually turns out to be the land of morning surprise. And once again, that didn't fail to disappoint even during this visit. So what I would say, first of all, on the theme of surprise, more than 2 years ago, before the current administration started using the term Indo-Pacific, Asan convened a panel on this very issue in the fall of 2015. And again, it shows that Asan's ability to get out ahead of the curve, have a really informed discussion about a trend that they saw coming and eventually came to fruition. And it was a panel not dissimilar from this. Some of the players are the same, some have changed, but at its core was the Australian ambassador, then Bill Patterson. Vikram was the sitting ambassador. Myself and others were there as well. But again, just I think a real credit to Asan in predicting, analyzing, and finding an ability to get out ahead of, you know, an emerging issue. What I thought I would do quickly is, since we did a similar panel in 2015, and thinking about where we are today, is just kind of quickly go through, I think, kind of some of the points of continuity, points of difference, and some of the challenges confronting the current administration in the United States. You know, I think the more we got into the rebalance in the Obama administration, the more voices like Mike Greens and Rich Armitage and others said, that really is a continuation of a bipartisan legacy of U.S. foreign policy towards Asia. And I think, there is an important element of that running through the Trump administration's policy towards Asia. So I think the first point I just wanted to make, though, is remember that the Obama administration, it took 2+ almost 3 years to formulate and ultimately promulgate and effectuate the rebalance, pivot, whatever you want to call it. I think there was an idea of where we wanted to go early. So the comparison to the Trump administration 14, 15 months in is imperfect. And I think, there is the element of time that comes into play here. Second, I would say, you do have some interesting green shoots of the policy in the various speeches given by the president, then Secretary Tillerson, Secretary Mattis's speeches at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and various and sundry lower-level officials that are attempting to implement or formulate and implement this strategy simultaneously. In terms of continuity, the term Indo-Pacific, it's funny, in Washington everybody argues about the terms, right? There was a fierce battle inside the Obama administration over pivot versus rebalance, and now we're rebalance, pivot versus Indo-Pacific. And I often highlight to friends that this term was floating around PACOM and in Japan, years ago. So I think rightly so captured on an interesting term but has a little bit of continuity in its very definition. Second, I would say in terms of continuity, I think you can argue that there is, for all of the possible distractions in Washington, for all the global problems the Trump administration faces, from Syria, the Middle East, Europe, Russia, there is still a focus on Asia, and we can have a discussion about how deep that focus is. But you cannot. I don't think you can argue that there has been deep focus on China, deep focus on the Korean Peninsula, India, Japan, and others. So I think that's one area of continuity. Second, I would say, there's a fair amount of travel and diplomatic activity. I think, though, it suffers more from lack of people in positions than lack of focus. On the military front, I go back to Secretary Mattis's speech, and that there's a lot of continuity there. You look at 60% of the Navy is still in the Pacific, 2/3 of Marine Fleet Forces, 55% of the Army, and 60% of Air Force overseas tactical assets are here in the Asia Pacific, and that is, again, an element of continuity. Also, I would say many of the main values espoused, rule of law, settling disputes peacefully, and I think a derivative of that, which the Trump administration has used, I think, more forcefully, is freedom from coercion, falls from the first two elements that were widely used in the Obama administration. Emphasis on economic integration. Also, I think, at least in speeches, this shows up a fair amount in the Trump administration, and I think that is something the Obama administration set out to do as well. Turning to what's new and different, well, first, you have on the one hand the emphasis on economic integration, but obviously trade policy. I mean, it's almost self-evident and obvious to say it, but it is a real divergence here. Just TPP, 301, 232, now possible CFIUS reform, Japan Steel, VRA in Korea, so on and so forth. That's a dramatic difference that has profound implications to the region. Second, I would say, in terms of the way the Obama administration tried to work through this issue, we tried to go alliance first. In other words, when we came into power in 2009, there was an argument within the administration about whether or not we should go sort of straight to Beijing and do kind of the G2 argument that people remember well. And the president decided what he wanted to do is focus on the alliances first. And it's an imperfect measure, but the time and attention of the president's always a good indicator. And you look in the first 6 months, you had the first visitor was the Prime Minister of Japan, followed shortly there by the Prime Minister of Australia, and the first Rose Garden ceremony President Obama ever held was with the President of Korea. You also can argue the first state dinner later to show focus by the Obama administration was with the Prime Minister of India, but undercuts my argument of alliance first, so I won't mention that too much there. But I think with the Trump administration, you're seeing much more point-to-point, sort of a diffuse outreach campaign than kind of a concentric circles that I think the Obama administration tried, albeit at times imperfectly, to effectuate. In terms of economic integration of South Asia, I think that's kind of a new concept by the Trump administration. I think it's very laudable. It's very interesting. I think there's a lot of talk about that. I think it's the question, and I'll get to this in the challenges section, is how do you actually implement that? But I would say it's not a complete break, but it's more of a point of emphasis that's new. I think in terms of China, especially towards the end of the Obama administration, I think confronting many of the same challenges, I think what you're seeing is a notch up in terms of the rhetoric, and then I think the security issues have shifted a little bit away from the South China Sea and much more to a North Korea conversation with the Chinese under the Trump administration. Obama, it was a little more 50-50 on the two. As was mentioned earlier, the concept of the Quad is, I think, something that has more focus in the Trump administration. And I've seen in a couple of Trump administration speeches the concept of anchors out of the Quad. The Obama administration pillars rather than anchors were not based on the Quad or a grouping of the Quad. It was the alliances, emerging powers, China, India, Indonesia, and multilateral institutions. Then I think this new and interesting concept that I've seen bandied about in Washington is this, alternative financing mechanism, or working with the MDBs to create more opportunities for alternative financing in South Asia, in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia. That's newer. I think it's fair to say I think this is not something the Obama administration put a lot of emphasis on, and I think that is new and interesting. Let me close by just running through quickly some of the challenges. First, prioritization for the Trump administration. I mean, the issues that I just mentioned, DPRK, the Korean Peninsula, China trade, alliances, India, economic integration, values, the list could go. I mean, those are huge issues. And how you prioritize those both in terms of time, resources is going to be critical going forward. Second, bandwidth, I think, is also a challenge. Again, you have a lot of vacancies in Washington. With luck, some of those will be filled in short order. Also, again, big issues. And the world's a big place, and there are lots of different challenges this administration confronts. So I think how you sort through the priorities and then translate that into limited bandwidth is critical. And third, resources. I felt at the end of the Obama administration, one of the most important things that was left a little understated was the impact of sequestration on trying to implement the rebalance pivot, whatever you want to call it. And secretaries of defense have said it, but I think it spilled over into other areas of foreign policy. But, Secretary Panetta, Secretary Hagel, Secretary Carter, now Secretary Mattis have all said it was devastating, and I think that is a fair stipulation. So I think resources, and you've seen cuts to the economic agencies, the State Department, USAID, how you are going to fulfill an ambitious agenda with bandwidth issues and limited resources is critical. And then finally, all of this deals with coordination. How are you going to coordinate both within the interagency and outward with your friends, partners, allies in the region to effectuate this policy? You've got to prioritize, so you go through the list, prioritization, bandwidth, resources, and then coordination. So let me just end by saying, first, I would argue that the Trump administration their Asia policy does continue. There are large elements of continuity of a bipartisan foreign policy towards Asia. Second, there are some new things that are of interest. There are some differences, points of emphasis, new initiatives that are, I think, interesting and worth examining closely. But finally, there are serious challenges, as I just went through, and how those challenges are addressed are going to be, I think, in large ways just positive of the success or failure of the Trump administration's policy. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark. Finally, Yoji.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for your very nice introduction. And of course, my gratitude to Asan. I have been to a number of Asan series of workshops before. Now, this time I learned tremendously from the participants already. I'm asked to do this topic. I suppose I would like to I mean, the expectation is that I would represent the Chinese perspective. Now, if this is true, the tone of my speech would be very different from all the previous speakers. We are asked to address 3 questions in this panel by the conference organizer. I will address them later, but I would raise 3 questions of my own. The answer to these questions reflect the Chinese perspective on this, we call it IP strategy, and of course my trend analysis of this concept myself. The first question is, why now? My colleague, Rory Medikoff, raised this concept more than 10 years ago. It has remained as academic. Japanese Prime Minister Abe invested ideational concept into this concept by creating a democratic arc in the Indo-Pacific region. However, it doesn't go very far because most of the stakeholders in the region would place their economic interests or strategic interests above the ideational preferences. When they do that, it is very difficult for them to accept this concept as their foreign policy guidance. But suddenly, it become a reality, become official strategy. I remember just 1.5 years ago, we had a conference in Canberra on this IP strategy. We were pessimistic because, as I pointed out to the conference, that unless U.S. embracement is available for this concept will remain academic probably forever. But suddenly you see the substantial change. The embracement of U.S. is now a political reality, and they turn the concept completely, different as we perceived just 1.5 years earlier. So why? I see 2 basic factors underpinning this kind of change from Washington. The first one is that Trump need a strategy, need a doctrine to replace the pivot to Asia, and this one is a convenient one. But more strategically, I think as James just mentioned, made this point that we see very visible naval and economic, we call the Western world naval and economic expansion by China. And of course, we see the eastward movement by India towards South China Sea, towards the West Pacific. There is a clash of movement at the naval, at the economic level. And of course, more importantly, we see the crunching point in Sino-US rivalry. Now, we talked about this yesterday, and in the sense that US need effective and more immediate countermeasure in this kind of rivalry. Second, what is the nature? Through long association with initiators of this concept, tend to look at this issue more from the strategic security and military perspective. Indo-Pacific region geographically is a probably future naval battlefield. More specifically, is a kind of venue for naval blockade of Chinese slug that actually associated with the long-term war planning of the United States. For example, in the concept or doctrine of air-sea battlefield, the unpublished part of it indicated that in case of a major Sino-US military confrontation, Australia should take responsibility to cut off the Chinese southward trade routes, and India will be called on to help to stop or to disrupt the slug movement of the Chinese ship in the Indian Ocean. And we see beyond that, the extension of U.S. island chain strategy in the West Pacific, extending into the Indian Ocean, all this kind of stuff. That, to me, the nature of the concept is concept of sharp power. than anything else. So in this regard, we probably see more Chinese naval build-up in countering this kind of military planning and the trend by the Quad nations. So in a way, this is a new concept of concert of powers with identified and targeted country as the specified enemy to be contained in the future. The third one is a mini NATO to come up with this kind of coalition building. Probably yes. I think this is a trend analysis. We see the process of coalition building uplifted from a relatively loose starting point. We call the trilateralism, basically between Canberra, Tokyo, and Washington, to incorporate in New Delhi and probably in the future Singapore, Manila, and other capitals in the region in the Indo-Pacific geostrategic area. So here, this is a result of the regional and the collective response to the challenge of rise of China to a large extent. The US has realized that by itself, the cost would be too heavy. Just like Professor Hugh White talked about it, the cost of containing China by one nation. And this reminds me of Prime Minister Yoshida's word in the 1950s that US was responsible for the safety of the countries all over the world. The cart is too big, the horse is too weak in this kind of context. So we see this kind of coalition building, and we probably see a different type of NATO, mini NATO, to emerge out of this concept and in the process of its building up. Now I address two questions that I'm supposed to answer by the raised to me by the organizers. Now the first one is what are the security challenges facing the Indo-Pacific region? I think there are two. I used to, just before this panel, I had only one underlying factor to talk about, and now I have two. And the first one is, of course, the uplift or the structure of regional territorial disputes into the process of geostrategic strife between the major powers. So previously, territorial disputes remain confined to territorial demarcation matters among the claimants, but today is no longer the case. It is more strategically oriented, and the outside powers use these kind of territorial disputes to, contain or to ease the potential or existing immediate security challenges. Here, of course, China is a kind of embodiment. Second, that is the my taking up of Joseph's point a bit earlier, that whether China would be persuaded to how China responded to the Quad idea. I think the response would be quite hostile, and that probably will stimulate China to invest more in military capabilities and play more, we call it a game of economic coercion or military deterrence and those kind of things that would change the nature of China's interaction with the Indo-Pacific region. Sorry, my time is up, right?
But time is running away with us. Yes, they want to close it earlier, please.
Okay. The second question is that can Indo-Pacific nations strike a balance between retreating America and rising China? First of all, I don't think America is retreating. The Indo-Pacific concept just indicates that the US military and political presence in the Indo-Pacific region will increase rather than decrease. Now, the balance is very difficult to strive. Now, my Australian colleague, Professor Hugh White, used this term of balance the relationship between a middle power and between China and the United States. So how, now for living in Australia for so many years, we are very familiar with this game. Now, how to have the cake and eat it too. That is to benefit Chinese growing market, at the same time to help the United States in its security pursuits and undertaking in the region. Very often it's very, very difficult to strike a balance. And the Indian Pacific region and the Indian Pacific concept of strategy will further shrink this kind of room for middle powers to maneuver in between. I think I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I just clarify with the organizers? I just got a sign saying there were 15 minutes to go. On my clock, there are 30 minutes to go. We could just work out, if there's only 15 minutes to go, I will go straight to questions. 30 minutes. Okay, thank you. I thought so. So sorry to rush you there slightly unnecessarily. I'd like to pick up on Mark's, I thought, very interesting comments on continuities and discontinuities between the pivot stroke rebalance and a free and open Indo-Pacific, and see where some of the rest of you stand on that. I mean, James, from Australia's point of view, you were pivotal to the pivot in many ways. I mean, how does it seem to you? And does it, as a sort of sub-question of that, does the Indo-Pacific solve Australia's long-running sort of geographical stroke identity crisis about where you are? You're never entirely within Asia, but nowhere else either.
Firstly, on the issue of US continuity, I would agree with Mark. I think there's a lot of debate as to whether the US is retreating, is it withdrawing, is it engaging? But from where I say as a diplomat, in terms of the arms of engagement, US is still engaging and still active. I don't see that US is retreating at all. I think the alarmist view that isolationism or populism is affecting US diplomatic or military or regional engagement, I think it's probably a little bit too alarmist. I see US remain engaged, and certainly from what we see from Australia, US wants to remain engaged, and Australia will continue to engage with the United States to play a role as a leader in the region. If anything, we want, from Australia's perspective, we want US to step up and play an even greater leadership role in the region. In terms of our geographic position and our identity, I don't think that really there's been much of a debate. Certainly in the 80s, we talked about whether we were an Asian country or how we fitted as a Western country with an alliance with the United States, but with increasing trade interests in Asia. I think the debate is over. Our trade fundamentally is with Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. Most of our student intake, most of our tourist intake, most of our engagement on people-to-people basis is now with Asia. Our migrant communities are mainly coming from Asia. So I think in terms of the government's use, the Australian government's use of Indo-Pacific, there's broad buy-in from our political classes and our domestic political audience and our electors, so there's no debate. Our future, Australia's future, is definitely in the Indo-Pacific.
Vikram, can I ask you about one specific aspect of the Indo-Pacific which hasn't come up, which is the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership? I mean, I suppose if anything gives economic unity to the idea, that is it. And yet, as I understand it, the biggest obstacles seem, from the point of view of the other potential partners, is India and your fear of sort of being swamped by Chinese imports. I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Actually, Simon, if I can be candid, no, it isn't. The simple fact is the challenge isn't so much one on the good side, because it's been portrayed consistently as India reluctant to open up markets because of Chinese sort of, and the Chinese productive capacity washing out Indian manufacture. That is a separate matter that is already being dealt with on a bilateral track between India and China on our own trade relationship. The larger problem for us has consistently been that the essence of what is wanted of India is the opening up of the Indian goods market. which, if you consider the rest of the members of the RCEP, is the only really big give that exists on the goods side. There is no other big goods market that is yet to be fully opened up. But an inadequate willingness among most of our other partners to offer us anything on the services side. Now, you can't have, as I think Professor Yogi just said, you can't have your cake and eat it too. We also need to have some benefits on the services side, on which there is almost no desire to even assure existing levels of services commitments, which is something of a challenge. But you're right, that is essentially one of the core issues on which we could look at a closer economic integration of the Asian region. The essence of all these compromises is always to try and get a balance of gives and gets. And there is a good balance of gives and gets that can be had, including on the goods side and on the services side, on which, quite ironically, actually, we don't find that much of a dispute, for instance, with our Chinese colleagues on the services sector. So this is possible, balancing out goods, gives and gets in goods and in services, to try and create a forward-leaning, sort of mutually beneficial RCEP within the next couple of years. Right now, of course, the process is largely being driven by bilateral agreements that are sort of already on the table. An India-ASEAN free trade agreement, an India-Korea free trade agreement, which exists these past 8 years and is actually being upgraded, an India-Japan free trade agreement, and our efforts to come up with one with Australia also. So eventually, we need to try and find a way in which these can all tie into a better, larger regional structure, in which the regional structure is actually more than just the sum of these individual parts.
Thank you very much, Vikram. Joseph, I'd like to pick you up, not just because of where you're seated, but on the question of ASEAN centrality. I mean, does it really matter that much? I mean, obviously, ASEAN's central to the ARF, to the East Asia Summit, to the RCEP, if like. But as you say, ASEAN is a price taker in all of this. Does it matter more than symbolically for the region?
Yeah, I think you raised a very important point, Simon. I think the roots, the genesis of this whole idea of ASEAN centrality, I mean, historically, it relates to the Cambodian conflict, the Third Indochina War, but substantively, it is predicated on this notion of, the fear of ASEAN irrelevance post, end of the Cold War and a regional architecture that was in flux, but also the idea that it was an opportunity at that time for ASEAN to be relevant to the emerging architecture by way of providing that neutral platform, right? We all remember those discussions, for the US and China primarily, but also Japan and China, etc., etc. The whole idea of the ARF arose out of that. But the situation has changed somewhat, and ASEAN is cognizant of that. So the situation now, quite apart from the fact that the relevance of the ARF is being questioned, is also that a lot of the external powers have created their own sort of nexus bilaterally, trilaterally. So that notion of ASEAN providing that neutral platform may no longer hold. But then what comes after that? And this is almost an existential issue for ASEAN, which is why ASEAN is pushing this issue of integration and ASEAN unity so hard. There is, and here I critique myself and my remarks, because there is an underlying assumption when we talk about ASEAN, we seem to just imply that ASEAN is united in its outlook. It is not on many issues. It is on some, right? But it is not on others, and some of these others are quite substantive, quite serious issues. So in a sense, the ball is in ASEAN's court, but how ASEAN is trying to play the game is to do two things at the same time. Continue to stress the centrality of ASEAN externally to the external powers. So the two recent summits with India and Australia, for example, ASEAN was very edified by the fact that the notion of ASEAN centrality was included in the statements. But on the other hand, internally, trying to impress upon all members the stakes that are involved if this unity is allowed to obtain within the organization. And that, in many ways, is perhaps the more challenging part of it all.
Thank you very much. Mark, could I sort of cruelly summarize your remarks and say, compare it with what Ben Steele was talking about in the previous session about the effort to repackage the TPP as an anti-currency manipulation pact? Would it be fair to say from your part that the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific is a way to repackage the pivot or rebalance in a way that gives the current administration clear blue water between it and the last one, but actually carries forward many of the same ideas?
I mean, I think if you, as I mentioned earlier, if you talk to the Bush administration figures, they would argue that the Obama administration's pivot and rebalance was not anything new other than a continuation and sustainment of a policy that they were busy formulating and effectuating that dated back decades before that. So, I would just say, I think that there are, as I mentioned, there are new elements here that are quite interesting and worthy of consideration, but I do think it builds upon a bipartisan legacy of engagement in Asia. I think, again, though, I'm less sort of focused on the label. I know that gets hot in Washington, and being someone who actually worked on the Senate committee that provided resources, I had a boss when I was 25 years old. He used to always say, you can have the greatest policies in the world, but if you don't resource it, it's not going to be a good policy. And I think that, so I'm really focused on, and then the other point is, in the executive branch, what you quickly realize is that the most scarce commodity is the time, attention, and energy of the senior policymakers. So in a way, I think there's large elements of continuity. The question to me is the success or failure, relative success or failure of this policy will come down to a lot of implementation, time, attention, and energy, and of course the resourcing. And those are critical components. Last point, I would just say, we still are at a place where the cake is not baked because we're early on in this administration. And I would argue that had, Obama's second term not materialized or sequestration would have not come into effect, we would be looking at different outcomes in the policy today.
Thank you very much. And Yoji, asking you to speak unfairly as China again, I mean, is it fair to say that we're still in the situation we were in the Obama administration, where China seems to be building up parallel institutions in which the US is not involved in more or less every area? So you've got the RCEP and trade, you've got One Belt, One Road, you've got a whole set of separate institutions where it's ignoring the traditional ones of the old ones of the old LIO and setting up its own where it has a greater influence.
Yeah. I think China is trying to build up these kind of institutions largely from the position of weakness. Now, China faces a whole coalition of like-minded, and they are very, very powerful as well. And if China is put in a position of confrontation with the United States, it probably needs friends or supporters. Now, the BRICS, Sino-Russian kind of de facto coalition, I don't use the word alliances. Now, that shows that China is vulnerable in this kind of security architecture, existing security architecture. In this regard, China has to protect its basic strategic interests, and it also needs to have a collective mechanism to do so. But to me, the recipe is not wrong in such a case, but probably the way they do it is creating more problems than solutions. Like One Belt, One Road idea clearly it has strategic and even military implications that would probably consolidate the existing security architecture vis-a-vis China. So this is one point. Another point, are these countries reliable supporters in case of any serious conflicts between China and the United States? The answer is very clear. It is not. They are not very reliable supporters in the first place. So I think China should reflect on these facts. No, yes, they are vulnerable. Now, Indo-Pacific region just hit the vulnerable point. Indian Ocean is China's undersoft belly. China has no capabilities to protect its sailings of communication safety with existing naval capabilities. And exactly because of this, in my view, China should develop better relationship with India rather than thinking in ways of some of the Chinese naval planners. For example, now our slot is vulnerable because we don't have escort the fleets based on aircraft carriers, but we can do it in a reverse way. That it is difficult for us to protect our slots, but it is a lot easier to disrupt your slots. So, for example, nuclear attack submarines sent to the Indian Ocean, in case this kind of thing that would happen. Of course, this is logical military planning, but at the strategic level, Sino-Indian relationship is more important than anything else. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring in the floor now if there are any questions for our panelists or indeed comments, contributions. We have a lot. Let's start with Doug in the front row. We'll take these three together.
Thank you, Simon. Doug Paul from the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Yoji was just scratching at the question I'm going to bring up. But listening to this discussion, I'm wondering what the panel thinks about the occasional allegation that the maritime Silk Road is a stalking horse for a kind of string of pearls of bases from Burma to Maldives on to Djibouti. And the further question is, in this era of high-tech, long-range, very accurate and very lethal weaponry, why are we even talking about these kinds of slot protection? It seems to me it's a late 19th, early 20th century dilemma, which raises the further question, maybe we should encourage China to build to that and spend as much money as possible on that in the sure knowledge that it's a waste.
Thank you very much. There's a question just 2 rows behind.
I didn't hear too much about the issues I was very much concerned about. When you talk about the region, the two primary issues are the economic welfare and then geopolitical security issue to underpin that. Now, clearly, as we talk about Indo-Pacific areas, which excludes China, the primary concern is the challenge posed by China. Not only China is large and the trade relationship is big, but let's not forget that India, Vietnam, and South Korea have exchanged fires with China. And China now is talking about, in the way, they seem to rebuild the past where China really dictated the rest of the world, never negotiated the rest of the world. And notice that Chinese ambassador arriving in Seoul, his first voice was that, hey, we are the big nation, you're the small nation. Now, this is not the kind of pronouncement you expect from arriving ambassador. And we are not talking about it, but I think there's clear concern for the smaller nations around China to how to interact with China when they pause, in fact, when they bully around the neighbors. And what I like to hear from the panel is what they think about what would be our course of actions to counter that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Yu Chosoya, a professor of international politics at Keio University. Because there is no speaker in the panel from Japan, and I'd like to present the Japanese viewpoint on this strategy because Prime Minister Abe has been quite active to present this strategy. Last July, there was a summit meeting between Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping, and the previous month, in June, Prime Minister Abe, for the first time, clearly mentioned that he is willing to support China's OBOR strategy. And then the next month, in July, Prime Minister Abe said to President Xi Jinping that there should be some coordination between the two strategies, Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and China's OBOR. And President Xi Jinping partly agreed Prime Minister Abe's statement. So after that, I have seen some kind of coordination between Japanese strategy and the Chinese strategy. That's why I think it's wrong to assume that Japanese aim is try to contain China because, well, it contradicts to what Prime Minister Abe has been doing. So that's why there is a widespread misunderstanding or the confusion between the Quad strategy among the particularly security cooperation among the four countries and Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy is quite inclusive. So that's why I have one question to panelists. My question is, how do you think about the role of Quad in promoting Indo-Pacific strategy? Of course, there must be some role of the Quad, I mean the four countries cooperation, whether this should be the core of the Indo-Pacific strategy, or whether this should focus on the importance of value in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we're probably only going to have time for you all to respond to whichever of the questions you like, just one more time. But perhaps could I start with you, Vikram, because may I congratulate Doug on one of the most glorious mixed metaphors I've ever heard. But can I ask you, is the maritime Silk Road a stalking horse for the string of pearls? I'm guessing in India that is where that view is most current. Yeah?
In the happy spirit of mixed metaphors, well, first of all, I think if you see what we've been saying on the subject, I think we've been reasonably clear that our primary focus is really on some parts of the OBOR strategy which are directly problematic for us, in a sense, as we've said, which lead, the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which leads directly through territory that we consider illegally occupied and illegally handed over by Pakistan to China. So there is a sovereignty issue on that, and that is, as we all know, in China and in India, these are things that are not something we can sort of fudge merely by words. So there is a thematic and sort of existential problem on that particular front. There are other concerns that we have, which we have articulated, but those are ones that can be discussed, which are fundamentally with regard to the way that the OBOR structure functions in economic and financial terms. Beyond that, we have, as we have consistently conveyed to our Chinese colleagues, we have no concern vis-a-vis China's legitimate relationships with many of our neighbors, with all our neighbors, in fact. Our only concern has consistently been where these develop a military footprint. On that, I think there is a robust dialogue with China right now to try and address each other's concerns on these counts. And I think what Professor Yoji said was certainly very interesting, the idea that the more logical way of addressing complex challenges to our respective security of sea lanes for energy traffic, for movement of our goods and commodities, is a cooperative framework in which the Indo-Pacific, in particular the Arabian Sea and the Indian and the Bay of Bengal, are treated as shared global commons in which we can work together rather than exclude each other from it. Which is why I think one of the points that I made when I summarized what the my Prime Minister had said in the US Congress was essentially the point about inclusive, not exclusive mechanisms, and connectivity and not isolation. Our intention is certainly not to try and work on any strategy that excludes China. We don't see the Indo-Pacific as being complete without a larger Chinese role. In fact, how can you exclude Asia's largest nation from a structure that is fundamentally Asian? So that is certainly not the Indian intention. Our preferred option would be, however, to work closely with our Chinese friends on dealing with specific issues where we may have apprehensions, which was my point about apprehensions. If these are unaddressed, these lead to each country then taking on hedging strategies against what it believes are the motives of the other country. Because all you tend to look at then is capabilities rather than actual facts. So capabilities, of course, China has capabilities that are immense and growing. It is important for us, therefore, to be able to dialogue with China in a manner in which we address concerns regarding how China intends to use these capabilities. And I believe, with our Prime Minister scheduled to undertake a carefully worked but only recently announced no-ties summit in Wuhan with President Xi Jinping, the intention is to work on our relationship much more intensively.
Could I ask the rest of you just to take...
Of course, Modi doesn't wear a tie, but that's another story.
Just to take 1 minute each to answer whichever of the questions you feel was most directed to you, starting at the far end, Yoji.
Okay.
Perhaps on this question on slots, for example.
Yeah, so you are right. I think China has made strategic decision to seek, we call the chain of overseas bases. That is total departure from the previous government's policy on this. Especially the military PLA has this kind of bottom line thinking. I think it's logical. I'm not holding anything against it that, since you see 70% of cargo ships, go through a very vulnerable slog, what do you do? Submarines, aircraft carriers, I think it's the first thing you think when you think about the slog safety. But as I mentioned earlier, slog fundamentally is a political concept today, not a military concept. Just imagine, China has sea lanes of 18,000 nautical miles. How many carrier battle groups you have to construct in order to have these lines under proper protection? It's impossible. Therefore, we don't blame the bottom line thinking, because the challenge is there. But it is a positive or probably the worst kind of response or reflection on these kind of security challenges. We are the big power, you are the small nation. To me, it's quite natural in international relations. I'm an AR specialist. When I say American uses sometimes harsh languages to champion its national interests, it's kind of normal in a way. But there has to be a balance, we call the fine balance between protecting your perceived national interests on the one hand, because it is related tremendously to domestic politics, and being sensitive to other people's concerns. So this is a very important thing for the Chinese to do.
Mark, do you want... You don't feel you have to answer anything.
I'll just say 2 seconds on the role of the Quad. I guess I would fold it into part of my strategy on multilateral institutions in Asia writ large, rather than making it the sole and only focus. Put your bilateral piece with the neighborhood, and then obviously use the Quad in conjunction with things like the EAS, ASEAN, so on and so forth.
Thank you. Joseph.
On the point on countering China, from the Southeast Asian perspective, you basically have 3 options. One is capitulate, and we hope to the high heavens that doesn't happen. Second is to confront head-on, and we hope to the high heavens that doesn't happen. The third option is to provide alternatives. Okay, and here is where I think not enough has been done. The underlying assumption is that you have certain regional countries that are not just dependent, but really existentially dependent on China. And the example I always give is the Mekong Delta region. How external players have taken their eyes off that, and as a result, China is basically the dominant, the hegemon there. And these are the lifelines of Indo-Chinese states. The US had the Lower Mekong Initiative, which lost steam, The Japanese had their own initiatives which lost steam. The Koreans actually have a Korean development fund for the Mekong. You know how much investment that is per year? $1 million for R&D. Okay, compared to what the Chinese are doing there. I mean,
well, the ADB had quite a big scheme for years, didn't it?
Sorry?
The ADB had quite a big the GMSR.
Yeah, but again, nothing compared to what the Chinese are doing and
if you're upstream, you have more power.
Yeah. So that's why this dimension of the call it the Quad, call it the Indo-Pacific, whatever, has to be attention has to be given to this and fleshed out. Create alternatives so that states don't find themselves gravitating to the Chinese orbit without any control.
Thank you. James, you have the final word.
Thank you. Just on the challenges posed by China, I think it's just right that China plays a greater strategic role commensurate with its economic weight. It's impossible to contain China. I don't think the Australian government would even consider contemplating such an ideal. But with leadership role comes responsibilities, and for China, the message that we keep on sending is that if it wants to be a leader, it should remember the rules on which it actually grew, the international rules-based order, things like respect for sovereignty, non-interference, peaceful resolution of disputes, freedom of no unilateral actions, and freedom from economic coercion. And so the message that I would send is those rules apply to all countries, regardless of whether you're big or whether you're small.
Thank you very much. And I think that brings our panel to a close. So thank you all for participating. And please give a warm hand to our excellent panelists.
Thank you very much. This concludes our morning session. We will now proceed to our lunch break and book launch. Lunch will be provided in the foyer right outside this room. At 12:30, we will invite Dr. Michael Green to this room to celebrate the launch of his book, By More Than Providence. You may bring your food with you and join us. Thank you very much.